Thanks everyone. So yeah, this is the final session, just a discussion following. So if you've got any questions, I had to run and do a bit of housework in the last session, so I missed some of the talks, but Gemma's just filled in on what she spoke about. I'm familiar with Francesca's work, so I'll do some kind of job of chairing. So yeah, I guess there's been another mixture of perspectives, but this sort of metaphor of threads and discrete structures and different systems that are representing one another somehow, that we're moving between. And yeah, really nice to have the idea of flow come into this, the idea of optimum experience of making life not too difficult, but not boring, but sort of navigating it. Yeah, so does anyone have any questions they'd like to start off with, or shall I just go on for ages? I think it's probably best if someone does. Is that not? No? Okay. Okay, so maybe we should talk about these different levels of representation then, and how we're moving between them in our work, which is what pattern is about, I think, having one system which represents another, and you make changes in one, and then strange things pop up in this other domain. Good.
Well, to an extent, yeah. I mean, for me, pattern is it's just another language. It's a way of which you get on actually, the idea of cryptography and the idea of hiding information, encoding information. And it's what I said in my talk. Anytime that you can see a pattern, you know there's a code there, and that applies from the code in our kind of sense of it down to much alchemical code, to use the proper word in the sense of the first scientists, really, with the alchemists, and that was the point which everything I was talking about, the point where order and chaos aligned, the point where belief and cold, dry logic aligned. And yeah, anyway, that's about the end of my point with that.
In terms of pattern, I think of repeating patterns, and I just realised my work doesn't necessarily work on repeating patterns. You're working on a section of a pattern in a very much larger scale. I suppose the pattern comes through the action and the repetitive nature of what people are doing and the activities. But you're talking about cryptography and encode data. I was just thinking about another project I've done where we looked at punch cards and the relationship between the fact that they were used in America in, I think, 1890 in the first tabulating machine for tabulating the census data. And we encoded and did a project where people contributed their own personal data, and that was used to generate patterns afterwards.
Any other hands got on? Yeah, okay.
Possibly quite a simple question. Is there an example how the perception, like how people, how much, saying it very simply, how much chaos in combination with pattern can the human being understand and take most easily? Because I really like that juxtaposition, or like that combination of a pattern with like just splashes of colour, and like something that clearly isn't a pattern. And now you were talking about aligning things, until it reaches a stage of being a pattern or being like a repetitive thing. So what makes comfort? What makes it art, or what makes it something that people can actually perceive and understand and use?
For me, as an artist and as the work I produce, it has to be 51% order, just because otherwise everything falls apart.
Listening to the discussion in the first session, there seems to be a kind of underlying but unspoken politics in what we were talking about. So I'm wondering if there's any politics in your work, or if that's something you really want to talk about here. But I think once you're talking about encryption, we're talking about freedom, freedom of communication and control of your own, and this kind. Yeah, okay.
Just in terms of politics, something I really want to work on is using the geometry of the selfish herd, which I put up the paper for, and that's a 1971 paper. But in terms of building an app to go on smartphones which uses that so you can't be kettled, so you plot in an area where the process is going to be, everyone will get positions, and those positions will be generative, so there'll be no way for the police to actually control the process. So in terms of like my becoming politics, yes, I've got a few ideas.
Good. I'd say I don't get involved in actual politics because I don't understand any of it. But when you're talking about politics, of sort of maybe I suppose the approach to the way I work with people in the public is very much I try not to encroach on people, and kind of the general politics is that sort of personal relationship you have with someone in an engagement situation, and that you don't want to make the pudding and then forcibly participate. I always try and take a back seat. I think,
Yeah, I don't know, I guess I see the politics in my work between kind of my art school of thought, which is you think about the end product and work towards it, and have like a very determined, you kind of try and meet you have an image of success and you try to get as close to it as possible. And then the kind of more live coding view of things, that you kind of just make things and make them, and then kind of it's about the process really. And I don't know which one is better, but I've definitely been enjoying the kind of other way. It's been interesting to see kind of different approaches to that. And that is the process, not the product. So that's the kind of only politics that I've witnessed so far.
But away from coding though, in terms of the actual politics of an image, the reason I do non-representational art and I don't just draw a picture of a girl holding some flowers is this idea of whispering a message or a meaning as opposed to shouting it. And I think as soon as you draw something directly, you're instantly going to create something that someone could find a problem with or find some kind of solace with. And I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested in people understanding that there's more going on than what we're looking at, but not actually shouting that at all.
Saw a hand go up earlier. Who's that?
I was going to bring the subject back to this business of pattern, and where does the business between the chaotic and the organised? I'd like to use the word randomisation, which is something very important to me as a coder, somebody who codes music, but does not do it in a live context. I'm improvising in my studio at home with the results of coding, and the degree of randomization of it could be a pitch series. It becomes very important to me in the structural mechanics of putting a piece together. And when I spoke at the London Goldsmiths Symposium, I did point out that there are people, there were some great names in the weaving world, like Annie Albers, for example, who improvised. They worked intuitively, often with their choice of yarns in the weft, and made decisions that were not carefully planned out. And I wondered if this is that's why I was particularly interested in your discussion of flow and the way that you're moving in that direction, because you started to look at brainwave automation. So my academic home is in Plymouth at the Interdisciplinary Centre for Computer Music Research. Have you met the people there?
No,
Well, I think you need to, particularly Alexis Kirk,
Okay.
who would be very, very interested in what you're doing. Because pattern is so important in brainwave, in understanding brainwave manipulation. I mean, they're looking at manipulation of music, being able to create musical work from brainwave data. And I'm more and more preoccupied in the tension, as a composer, the tension between randomization and repetition, and this level of how you randomize a generative thread, because what I'm trying to, in a way, what I'm trying to simulate is what I hear in some free improvisation, which can of course be wonderful, it can of course be dreadful. But I just wondered if this is an element that perhaps that comes into your all three of you, into your thinking. Thank you.
Thank you. My initial reaction to that is actually that I believe very little can be truly random, especially when a human's involved. Because I think, especially when it comes to pattern, I think you will automatically, based on previous experience or so when you're randomizing music, that will be based on what you know works together, possibly, I don't know.
Well, because a computer has a random generator.
A computer can, but if you're involved in the manipulation of that, I think there will always be a human element, and you will instinctively or intuitively somehow be putting rules upon that. But then in terms of, not saying you can't have something completely random, but then in terms of the coding that I'm doing with the flow and like the heart rate monitor and things like that, it was very important to me that when I was always glitching the patterns, that it wasn't random, that it meant something. Yeah, that was important to me, that it was a very simple rule. The pattern becomes clear if somebody's in flow, and the pattern becomes obscure if it's not. And I'll probably play with those levels as I get further on. But yeah, I was definite in the fact that I needed it to mean something. It wasn't just, let's make a random.
You make an interpretation that fits with you.
Yeah.
Leading on from what you said, in fact, it's just that using a randomizer isn't chaos. It's an algorithm that determines something that the human thinks is chaos, and that's completely different.
I was just going to say, with like your kind of normal random generators in computing, over time they kind of like average out, like if you kind of count the things. And I guess it's something that we've kind of inflicted upon computing ourselves, what like a kind of limit of what we think is random. And yeah, so it's not really within computing, because we made it ourselves, it's not really ever going to be that random, and I'm quite interested in that. Because when you're like coding something or just like messing around, if you want to just kind of put an element somewhere but you don't know what you want it to be, you put it to be random, and then sometimes you kind of dismiss it and change it, or you go on from there. And I find it quite interesting, the kind of, yeah, the idea of being random within computing as well.
Final point. Chaos is the absence of order. So you can't ever really describe chaos. You describe chaos by the order that complements it.
Before I was just going to say that even if you generate a random a sequence from the decay of atoms, you still end up with a sequence that isn't random. You've just generated it through a random process, and then you have a big sequence, and you find patterns in it, of course. I think it's important just to make a difference between a process and the actual material you end up with. Sorry about that.
That makes my brain hurt. I've got a question for Francesca. So I'm really mesmerised by the weaving thing going on in the corner. And for the weekend I was at a friend's house, and they showed me an app on an iPad, which was called Let's Create Pictory or something. And I'm quite interested in digital versions of craft processes.
Yeah.
And so on this app you can throw a pot, and you can throw pots that are unthrowable.
Yeah.
Like, physically they would be unthrowable, and then you decorate it, and everything works really perfectly. And it kind of made me cross at whether, so you've got the tactic bit of the things that you're messing with it, but I don't know, I'm just interested. Like, can you build in the craft of it going wrong?
Yeah, like that's definitely kind of an issue with the simulation, especially with weaving, because there's so many different factors that go into it, like outside of the simulation. And I think that we did talk about maybe making it more, because you can create a weave that doesn't work, but you kind of have to have weaving knowledge to know that like that's quite a big flow and that kind of thing. So I think that we were trying to think of ways to make it uncomfortable, but not like horrible, but kind of more uncomfortable, or kind of like make it obvious that way. And that's a design problem that we're encountering and thinking about.
That makes me think of Michael Eden's work as a digital 3D potter, I suppose. And he talks, when you hear him talk about how he uses the digital to recreate his process, having been a traditional potter who threw pots, he always talks about it was essential in having those skills, and he couldn't do what he does now. And I've been to a few conferences about 3D printing, and they talk about how it's all become so tabletop and everyone can access it, and we'll all have one in the next 10 years. And it's like, well, we might all have one, but not everybody's going to have those skills and that knowledge, and that it's still really important to have all those things going on.
Many technological workflows require intense amounts of hand skills still. I mean, I use a laser cutter regularly, and the amount of time that actually have to go back in with a scalpel, and actually do it traditionally as well. The two do go together. The technology won't replace hand skills. You need
I think that's when you're going back to then creating it as a physical object, whereas this app is purely digital.
And surely should incorporate the human into it to be proper, like you're saying, definitely.
Yeah, I suppose there's something about the digital and the analog that there's kind of there's anxieties involved that we've talked a lot about today, whether it's anxieties about mathematics or about being uncomfortable going out of whether you're using rules or working within moving between different communities. And the analog and the digital should be very balanced and should be interwoven, but we see them as somehow separate or simulating one another. And so I think it's, when we're working with pattern, then there is that balance there. I think you can focus on one side, the structure of a weave, but then when you make it, you have to confront the continuous texture, and it all becomes one. But still, when we're talking about the digital, it's almost like you use this software, but you're almost ashamed to use it because you kind of leave all the feeling behind. So I'm just wondering if you feel any conflict or anxiety about your work in terms of the way other people see it when you say that you use robotics or software or whatever. Any kind of imbalance in the way that something's viewed as opposed to the way you conceptualise it or anything like that?
I create artwork for myself. It's nice when other people like it. The point where I use technology is when I need to use technology. And it's what I kind of touched on in my talk, this idea that you need to get your data from somewhere, which would be digital, but then everything that I want to do with it needs to transfer that into the analog. And yeah, there's constant conflict, but I don't think you're a good artist unless you're unhappy with your work. That's true. And if you're progressing, if you're finessing what you're doing, then you should always be a bit anxious.
I suffer a lot with anxiety, but mainly I've suffered a lot with anxiety over the term being a maker for a long time, that I don't make anything physically that lasts, but I still see the processes that I'm using and the fact that I use other people to do it, but the processes are all about the making process, so I still try and refer to myself as a maker and an artist in that sense. But I did actually do a project jointly with a very analog maker where we looked at the two sides of digital making, because I use digital a lot. In fact, I even turned to digital for drawing now. I can't remember the last time I actually picked up a pencil and drew in a sketchbook, which is, I'm always ashamed to say. I just instantly go to Illustrator now, it's just become my tool. And so I worked with a woodworker, and we were looking at generating patterns, and we generated them randomly using a twister wheel. And we were trying to look at this theory of error that could occur, and error through human error and other kinds of errors, and we recreated the same 3D model generated through a series of patterns. And we took the same 2D shape and extruded them into three-dimensional form, and he made them in wood very intuitively and carved them out, and they were really beautiful and hand-carved. And mine were generated in a 3D software and sliced into pieces. And then I hand-built them again. And that was quite an interesting project in terms of looking at the two different sides. And in the end, we discovered that he found it quite enlightening watching it, because he just thought, well, it'll take you 5 minutes to do that. I was like, really won't. And I had just as many errors and complications and things to face as he did working with the physical material.
I guess as a programmer, apart from small bits of electronics I've done, everything that I've done is kind of digital within a computer. There's not really a kind of tangible output from it. And when I've been learning craft, I've been learning it kind of through the computer, through watching videos and simulation software, and working back that way, especially weaving. So I don't feel like my method is devalued in any way because of the way that I've learned it, but I've definitely grown to appreciate the kind of intuition and skill that does go into creating something analog.
Alex, I've seen you perform with a drummer, and I just wondered what your thoughts were on performing with a human, as it were, and how that influences your music making, possibly with other live coders.
Yeah, so I make music.
In terms of the human randomness.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. So I should explain that I do live coding. So when I perform, I'm completely in the digital, and I'm looking at my screen and typing, which is probably one of the most discrete movements you can do. Discrete meaning digital. So when I'm making music, I'm in a state of flow, working with this abstract language. But yeah, I'm interacting with people around me at the same time through this strange text. So it's really interesting. So working with a drummer, for example, Matthew E. King, we're performing together as musicians. So I'm typing, he's hitting drums. And that for me is one of the main motivations for what I do, is being able to do that work at a speed, whereas I can interact with someone who's working physically. Because I've always programmed, but it's a very lonely occupation, very disconnected. This is a physical connection. And it's the same reason why I really enjoy making dance music that people dance to. You get this very focused view where you're working with text, but also this very physical reaction that comes back. But then I also work in free improv. So working with Paul Hessian, for example, who he's just works on the boundary of anything. You never know what he's going to do next. So that's, yeah, very rich being able to respond in that way. But really I don't see these as separate worlds at all, because we talk about code as being digital, but it can describe geometry, which is continuous, can describe continuous functions. Synthesis is a lot of it's to do with sine waves, which are continuous functions. Yeah, everywhere. So I think the difference between digital and analog isn't really, it's just the way that you're looking at something, and everything's both intertwined. And so it's really nice seeing all the different ways today in which people do bring these together. And I think weaving and knitting is kind of where this has all begun, really, because there you have to work with discrete threads, but you end up with this continuous result with which you can view from all different perspectives. And in order to weave, you have to engage with mathematics, like the number 24 that we've noticed there. And prime numbers you have to avoid, and that sort of thing. So yeah, we kind of think of the digital as being new and weaving as being old, but actually weaving is digital, and everything new is just an echo of old stuff. So yeah, that's a bit grand. Supposed to be cherry.
This is going to be a short point. It's mainly nothing's new. If you imagine your parents having sex, you never would yourself.
Follow that. So, I think you've got time for more. Yeah.
I was just thinking about how a lot of you were sort of linking back to the historical use of data being visualised, and then the visual being turned back into data, and then the contemporary applications of this. And I was wondering if you could each speak about that in relation to each of your projects. If that makes sense.
Could you explain it again?
Yeah.
So with things like weaving, for example, you would start with a visual idea that has to be turned, I would say something like the Sheffield loom, which is made using a punch card system. You'd have to turn a visual image into data in order to turn it back into a visual image. With the patterns that Matt was talking about, that they, in order to create those images, they are mathematics and data was used to create them. But then looking at patterns, you can also take data out of them, the patterns to begin with. And that you're also working with punch cards and getting data from people and turning that into a visual thing. So I don't have an exact question, but I was wondering if you could sort of like talk a little bit more about each of your practice in relation to the sort of visualization of data and taking data from visuals.
Yeah, I probably, in terms of the projects that I showed, especially the Textiles of Flow project with the Whitworth, that was very much, I was working with a point paper that was a visual pattern, and then I suppose in a way that was turned into data and points and binary before I even took it into code. But the outcome, when you talk about turning it back into a visual again, I always got the sense that you meant in a sort of preemptive kind of way, whereas I don't see it that way. And the census project that we did with punch cards, I suppose I would have visualised it a little bit in terms of an outcome pattern. But the essence was that we wanted one single weft to represent one person, and the pattern that grew from that was completely not designed. So that was very much data to visual. I don't think I started with a visual at all with that. Maybe subconsciously.
It's what I touched on in my talk, is this idea of we've got two distinct works. I go into it, you're going, I know the pattern I'm doing, its pattern has a purpose, I want people to understand the basic truth of this pattern outline. Or generative complex patterns, which is just about dumping people in amongst it. And I don't know, data is a really interesting thing, and it is just about dragging data from everywhere. And often the data I'm dragging from historical sources has stuff encoded already. My third slide was a picture of the Cosmati pavement in Westminster Cathedral, and that was a plan written in this Dark Ages, whatever they are. It wasn't Dark Ages policy, 1400s. 3 generations of family, but mainly worked in the UK, and that was a plan for the apocalypse. You know, so every single image on that, every single roundlet had some number that relates to the next. But I'm ignoring that apocalypse data to take some beauty from it. So I don't know. I occasionally listen to what the old people are saying, and I occasionally just go, I can see what I can take from your image, and it could be how it's been destroyed. I hope I've explained it a bit anyway.
Yeah, so I guess with weaving, my own kind of physical experiences with tablet weaving, and that's when I did the Gravatar. And although I kind of projected it to look a certain way, by the end it didn't, and it did go through kind of several modes of representation. So I generated the image, and then in my mind I kind of codified it into binary, so which colour would be which. And then I put it into a live coding language as to picturing the movements that I would make when I was weaving it. And then which was translated into a JPEG of what it would look like, and also instructions on how to achieve it. And yeah, so I do feel like it was kind of abstracting further from the original idea, the kind of more that was going through it, especially because due to my kind of lack of weaving knowledge, it kind of didn't look like it at the end. So I think that although things may appear similar, maybe through abstraction of method, sometimes it might be further away.
Perhaps there's always that case of like the happy accident where
Yeah.
you sort of, you know what you're aiming for, but then you come across so many variations of something that you then lead you down a different path, which I think is the nature of art in general.
I generally do 50 versions of the same thing as well. So, you know, I have a distortion of language along a theme. So, I don't know, I'll go into something with a code, but then that'll get distorted. And I'm not exaggerating, 50 versions of everything. You find out that you've got this kind of human distortion away from the pattern which you intended to do. It just happens.
We're kind of at the end of our time now, unless anyone's got anything burning they want to ask. But we've got a bit of time to explore this textile matrix, pattern matrix. So you can come up and do that. But otherwise, I think we'll draw things to a close. For those coming to Access Space later on, see you there. We'll have some quite loud audio-visual experiences. We will have some earplugs, so if you're not used to that level of loudness, we're happy with that. But yeah, I'd like to thank everyone for taking part. Everyone who's here, it's been really good. I'm very glad you all managed to come. A couple of days ago, I think we only sold about 6 tickets, so it's great that you got them in. And it's great there's so much interest in this, and I hope you all take what you got from here and take it in a different direction. And yeah, let's applaud each other. Thank you.